Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Nicholas Scherf. I'm the Communications Director at the Center for Applied Linguistics. Thank you for joining us today for this 30-minute webinar in our Critical Conversations, Research to Policy and Practice series. This year, our theme is Multilingualism Without Borders. We're examining spaces where multilingualism is practiced across, through, and around all kinds of borders and barriers. Today's webinar is Critical Multiliteracies Beyond School Borders, Heritage Language Involvement in the Community. We're recording this webinar and will post the recording on cal.org after the event. Before we begin, please mute your microphone to avoid interruptions. You can activate closed captioning by pressing the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. The Center for Applied Linguistics is providing this event as a public service. However, the views, thoughts, and opinions expressed belong solely to the presenters and do not necessarily represent the views of the Center for Applied Linguistics. Our panel comprises esteemed experts who work at the intersection of research, policy, and practice in language education, language access, and equity. You can learn more about our guest speakers on the webinar's cal.org webpage, where you can also find resources they may reference during today's call. We'll share the link in the chat. After the call, we'll update the page with the call recording and email the link to our attendees. We encourage you to ask questions via the Q&A box. We'll answer as many as possible at the end of our discussion. It's an excellent opportunity to tap into the incredible wealth of knowledge we are fortunate enough to have on today's call. Also, click the chat button at the bottom of your screen anytime to share your thoughts and comments. Try it out now by letting us know where you're listening from today. I will now pass the microphone to our first facilitator, Matilda Reckford.
Thank you, Nick. Today we have Sejong Kim, who will share their research and perspective on questions around linguistically and culturally appropriate messaging. Sejong Kim currently serves as Program Officer for Europe and Eurasia branch at the U.S. Department of State, and she was a National Security Education Program Scholarship Awardee for the English for Heritage Language Speakers program, where she conducted research on communicating security threats to limited English populations. Thanks for joining us to talk about this topic. So we have 30 minutes, so let's begin. Sejong, we'd love to hear about your work at the U.S. Department of State and about your research on communicating security threats to limited English populations. Can you tell us how it addresses issues of community involvement and culturally appropriate messaging?
Sure. Thank you, Matilda. And thank you, Cal, for organizing this webinar and for inviting me to speak in today's event. It's an honor and an excitement for me to share the research I conducted last year. And before I begin, I would like to also put a little disclaimer that this webinar includes my personal views and opinion as an individual scholar participating in the English for Heritage Language Speakers program, which is sponsored by the Department of Defense from last year, as well as also I'm not representing the official view of Department of State. Well, that being said, my official title is Program Officer, and I'm working for Office of International Visitors at the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. Department of State, which is very mouthful. But basically, day to day, I work with a program called IVLP, which stands for International Visitor Leadership Program. It's a premier short-term professional exchange program for emerging leaders from around the world in a number of really diverse range of fields. So we have groups of individuals who are interested in emergency management or climate change or perhaps space development. But I recently managed a project focusing on refugee and immigrant integration because it is a big and very eminent issue in Europe. And as I work with Europe and Eurasia branch, we welcomed a group of visitors, about 9 to 10 visitors actually in that group, who visited Washington, D.C., but also different parts of the country in Orlando, Pittsburgh, and San Diego, where they observed and learned how U.S. approaches on the local and state level of language access, education issues, policy issues related to that particular topic, which I think is quite relevant to today's topic as well. And we actually had 2 Ukrainian visitors in that group as well, because again, it's an immediate issue that they're facing. And many visitors were working for both government and non-government sectors, looking into integration of Ukrainian refugees in their regions. So yeah, that's what I do on day-to-day basis. It's a lot of collaboration, I have to say, with state and local organizations that work with a particular topic, in this case for refugee and immigrant integration. But further into what I did the year before in my research, in 2022, I participated in, as I mentioned, EHLS program, English for Heritage Language Speakers program. And I have to give you a little bit of my background. I'm an immigrant myself. I moved to the US in 2014 and have lived here and call this home. So I am a new American. And as part of this particular program, which is geared towards heritage language speakers and new Americans to have professional training and sort of glide into federal career if they're considering, we conduct open source analysis project. And my topic was sponsored by Department of Homeland Security, focusing on communicating Homeland Security threats to what we call limited English populations. So limited English populations, LEP, is a group of people whose English is not their first language and are not fluent in that language. And surprisingly, about 1 out of 10 working individuals in the US they self-identify according to US Census Bureau as LEP populations. So Department of Homeland Security operates this announcement system called National Terrorism Advisory System to provide counterterrorism information for the public. So it's a sort of a public service, and these are announcements issued on DHS websites. So Department of Homeland Security has a designated website where they share domestic terrorism alerts in a regular basis. And it's first introduced in English language, but then they have several translated versions, which are available in a number of different LEP population languages, ranging from Arabic, Chinese, all the way to, of course, Korean, which is my first language. And their intention is to reach the limited English populations. But my 2 mentors who I work with at the Department of Homeland Security headquarters, who represent the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, which are oftentimes the offices in federal governments that has more relationship with language access, they were curious and interested to know how these translated messages are reaching, or perhaps not very well reaching, the target audience. So with my background being in corpus linguistics and experimental phonology research, and also as an immigrant, this was a very near and dear topic to me. So I got to do some linguistic analyses as well as interviews with the community members. So there were several aspects that sort of revealed why LEP population may not have good access to this information, even though there's a good intention. So first, perhaps a little bit more boring, but I'm sure we have some linguistic folks out there listening in today. So linguistic analyses revealed, first of all, I did the original announcement in English. I checked readability tests, right? So some of the common ones are Flash Kincaid and Gunning Fog. And it turns out that the original text was very difficult to read for most readers in English. It required college or even plus, so graduate level degree to comprehend these texts. And there are some federal government agencies that has a very strict guidelines for this readability score, like 8th grade level, I think, for I believe DOD, especially for recruitment purpose, but it's not enforced across the board all over. So the test revealed that the terrorism alert announcements were ranging more towards similar to like Wall Street Journal level, which is very difficult to read. And then I looked into Korean translation, and that also revealed that there are grammar, word meaning, and language choice that may affect comprehension of the Korean translated version of this announcement. So I'm just going to give some example. There were grammatical aspects that reverse order, right? Subject, verb, object versus subject, object, verb order, which is completely opposite for some of the languages that were the destination language for these announcements. That definitely messed up a little bit with the readability, especially because the sentences were very long with lots of phrases. And then there were English specific grammatical components that didn't quite get translated, though so the text was in Korean, but the components were like 100% there that was English specific, such as hyphenated insertion, semicolon, and connectors such as and, slash, or doesn't really carry that same meaning when it's in the destination language in Korean. So it kind of contributed to awkward sentence structure, which kind of pauses your native speaker instinct as you read. So it gets clunky. And then because some of the target languages, including Korean, do not have passive voice. So certain English words with inherent passive voice, such as fueled by several factors, caused further confusion for the readers as they read through the text. And then finally, fluctuation between formal and casual language in Korean translation. And I also looked at Thai translation with a Thai bilingual speaker, and she also agreed that there were fluctuation between formal and casual language for languages with honorific expressions that were noticeably distracting for native speaker readers or bilingual readers, because it causes readers to start questioning the authority of the official government announcement, which sort of lowers the trust in the and validity of the announcement itself. And then I also had a chance to interview some of the members of Korean American community, and found out first that the website was not very well known to begin with. And then I had a chance to search through different Korean American news media based out of the US. And only short clippings of the announcements were introduced through the news clips, which may come across perhaps not as effective than the full announcement, right? And then also importantly, many Korean Americans do not consider that domestic terrorism threats is directly relevant to their daily lives. Sometimes they have a very specific stereotyping when it comes to the word terrorism, and consider like, oh, not related to me, so I don't need to read this, or I don't need this piece of information. And many Korean Americans access their news through radio channels or local newspaper or popular social media platform called Kakao Talk, sharing news. So all of that combined, it was that they weren't really exposed to the fact that this piece of information is available. And when they saw that it's also available in Korean, they were actually surprised in a pleasant way. But their reaction was like, well, didn't know that it exists. So in conclusion, these aspects, there were several aspects, whether linguistically or culturally, that sort of prevented easy access to this information, which is super important, of course. Slightly due to lack of understanding of that target audience, I think.
Thank you for those examples. I see that our guest, Paul Posilovsky, also joined us, and I'll give a quick introduction. Paul Posilovsky is the Washington Army National Guard Command Language Program Manager, and is overseeing the training and testing of over 122 Army linguists across 26 languages in various intelligence disciplines. Thanks for joining us. And I'll also kick right off with a question for you. Can you talk about missions the Washington Army National Guard Command Language Program has conducted regarding similar concerns in the US?
Hi, yes, so this is Count Paul Pachulowski. Paul is more than good. But again, thank you again for giving me the opportunity to speak. So to begin, I would just like to provide a little bit of context for what an Army linguist is, or maybe some of the misconceptions about that. So within the Army National Guard, we currently do not have like a military occupational specialty coded as Army linguist. What we do have are jobs that are language enabled, meaning that they do require a language to perform the job. The two main roles are Signals Intelligence Voice Interceptor, or 35 Papa, 35P, and Human Intelligence Collector, 35 Mic or 35M. The training pipeline can typically take about a year and a half to 2.5 years long, and that includes language school. So when I was a commander, I would see soldiers hit our books, but I would not see them in my time as a commander. So trying to give a little bit of perspective there. So my program, the Command Language program, picks up once a soldier completes Defense Language Institute. They initially get their language and they arrive to their formation. And my job as the program manager for the state is to help maintain that language for them and actually enhance it as well, if at all possible. Since soldiers that we recruit are typically from the very community that they serve in, many are heritage speakers. Washington State has a lot. So we have a pretty diverse community. So we're fortunate to have the cultural expertise that you can only find by growing up in that language. But that's not saying the schoolhouse does not train to that level of proficiency, because at the end of the day, we have to rely on all soldiers with that language capability when it comes to language enabled missions. So our training is robust in that manner, where we have to take into account our language population as a whole. So regarding missions, most of you know that the last few years has been quite the roller coaster when it comes to natural disasters, civil unrest, and COVID. The Guard has had to balance that and its federal mission requirements as well. So even myself, I had an overseas tour as part of a NATO battle group. So you have to take all that into account when you're looking at not necessarily just the Army linguists, but the soldier themselves. So the key takeaway is that regardless of the mission, I personally have observed an increased reliance on language professionals as enablers to assist with getting critical information out to the community and commanders. Going back to my program and how it assists the state fulfill its language requirements, is important to understand that, getting a little bit of some issues online. It's important to understand that my programs that provide guidance to commanders. So we don't inject ourselves into the mission itself, but we provide commanders with the guidance when it comes to language, and we facilitate that role, because ultimately those linguists, they sit in that formation. They don't sit in at my program level. Now, when it comes to specific missions in mind, I think the best example we have is COVID. When COVID began to kick off, we started to realize that there was a large gap between the messaging that we were putting out and some of the communities not being able to receive that messaging that we would have, or that we would like to have. So the intent wasn't getting across. So our linguists were leveraged in that way, because we have that expertise that can actually provide that context when it comes to translating those messages themselves. So I had the opportunity to oversee some of these missions, and we were able to create some pretty awesome processes when it comes to having maybe those lower tier speakers do that initial translation, then going up to a QA QC level where you might have those heritage speakers, or perhaps even those higher proficiency speakers, begin to provide that extra bit of cultural nuance that you typically wouldn't have with that lower level speaker providing that translation. And I think that really did help our communities. A lot of these messages were through a variety of mediums, such as Twitter, pamphlets, things of that nature that we would send out. And it was nice also because we were able to complete these over reserve weekends. So being able to target those things kind of gave our soldiers an enhanced level of training and being able to provide that messaging to the community. I think that answers the question. If not, correct me if I'm wrong. I can keep going, but yeah, I think that's it for me on that one.
Thanks very much. Okay, it's my turn to ask a question. And this is a question for both of you. So maybe, Sijang, you could start and then we could move to Paul. So could you talk to me about the best dissemination strategies that leverage heritage language skills and knowledge? Maybe also touch upon some areas that non-English language communities would benefit from increased readiness for, terrorism, emergency preparations. And what policy recommendations would you make?
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. I think it's all very relevant to my research as well, and also my hands-on knowledge working with IVLP, the International Visitor Leadership Program. I would say that there's certainly a big importance in building trust from the limited English proficiency communities, right? It's not just about having the announcement out there, and Paul already mentioned that involving that heritage language speakers, that's a great first step in terms of also disseminating the fact that we're working to serve that community, right? Because the word of mouth is really important. And also involving community organizations, heritage language and organizations in the process of drafting the messages, and see if that messaging works in a diverse range of age groups, right? There might be a first generation or just immigrant, and then there might be second, third generation heritage speakers group who may feel differently in certain messaging. So it's really good to involve diverse age range. And there's examples, for instance, in Ohio, the local government had the mental health toolkit developed for Bhutanese Nepali community, and they involved the community organization serving for that particular language group. And in that process, it just the whole process itself was very collaborative in a way. It raised awareness for mental health health itself. But then the toolkit also involved culturally appropriate expressions, because sometimes it is stigmatizing in certain cultures, or taboo to even discuss certain aspects of mental health. So I think, as Paul mentioned, public health situations is huge. Emergency preparedness, certainly. FEMA uses actually symbols instead of, well, not instead of language, but on top of languages, they use symbols and sounds and colors to alert people. So non-linguistic aspects can also be very helpful. I would recommend, so in short, involving local non-English language community organizations for whether the language and the message is culturally appropriate, but then also to check translation quality before really pushing out that message, and then use the diverse communication channels, word of mouth. Local religious organizations are huge also centers to disseminate languages. And then in terms of policy recommendation, I would highly recommend constantly reviewing the current language access policy and revise it, because it's not perfect. And we learned that especially during the pandemic. And many of our visitors from outside of the US are always impressed to see that people are willing to admit that the system is not perfect, yet we are willing to fix it by reflecting on some of the things that did not work. So that's the biggest recommendation I would support.
Paul, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of great points. I mean, I agree with pretty much everything you said. There's been quite a significant amount of challenges for us when it just comes to leveraging our linguists effectively, I would say. And I think touching on maybe expanding on one of the things that you pointed out, but our emergency management division, for example, here in Washington State, and how we tie into those agencies. Now, understanding that 35 Papal and a 35 Mike, these are they're essentially intelligence MOSs, and language isn't typically the first priority. It's a secondary priority. Now, with that being said, what the perception that we have to deal with if we're going to use a soldier like that to perform these types of missions. Are they back and facing? Are they forward facing? And these are the things that we typically have to deal with, and we have to be very careful with how we leverage those soldiers. So when it comes to translated material, typically I think that's okay, and that does work from an intelligence oversight perspective. But when we start to go into something more forward facing is when we have to be very careful with how we implement those soldiers. examples can be anything from what we've witnessed with civil unrest, right? Like, I think the last thing you would want is an intelligence professional working on a mission like that. It gives very bad optics, regardless of the mission they're performing, if it's just translation. But now if it's COVID response, right? If you're just sending out translated tweet or twit messages, I can't use my words, but everyone gets the point, right? Maybe it's X now. Those types of messages, then I think that's okay because it's screened ahead of time. It's gone through the proper channels. So we really have to be cognizant of that when we're from a guard perspective, right? Now, as far as policy recommendations goes, I think it's touching on exactly that, is how do we streamline that and how do we build a process around to actually support these soldiers in that status? So that way the public's on board, there's no violation of trust. Because I mean, culturally speaking, if there's a lot of people from different backgrounds that come into our community that if that's their first experience, then you might violate that trust and that message may be lost. So anyway, I hope that answers the question. I'll stand by for questions.
It sure does. One final question in maybe 1 minute or less to both of you. What are specific language-based issues that an organization like the Center for Applied Linguistics can address?
I'll go first. I'll be very quick. I used to work for the Department of State scholarship for critical language scholarship. So it's a summer program for undergraduate, graduate American students to go abroad learning critically needed languages. But I see the increase of heritage language speakers joining that program, which is great. But I also see that sometimes they are taking away that opportunity to learn heritage language growing up in the US. So I would love to see Cal addressing or perhaps discuss some of the impact for young and young adult learners of heritage language and perhaps focusing on the positive aspects, because I don't know if that is well publicized across the language communities.
So from my perspective, I think it's the awareness of the languages that we utilize within our community, understanding that as the National Guard, we're an operational reserve. We still get all of our funding from the active Army, and our priorities need to be aligned under that. And the language priorities for Big Army are not necessarily aligned to state priorities or state needs. So it ends up being a juggling act, at least from my program perspective. So how do we address that would be, I guess, awareness at first. I don't fully know the answer to that because that takes change at a very high level. But if it was a conversation at a state level to push for the importance of these, I would say lower density, I guess is the best way to describe it, languages, would be very helpful for us, because then that way we can start supporting those languages from my program and enabling those missions for commanders and then civilian entities. Thank you.
Thanks. So that concludes our discussion, and we thank our wonderful guest speakers for sharing their insights and expertise. And thank you for our audience for the great questions. We'll make sure to pass on some questions we've seen in the chat, and hopefully get maybe a quick response for you on our webinar webpage for those questions. But thank you so much for all your comments, enthusiasm around this important issue. Yes, and we'll email you a recording of this webinar. And yes, please share what you've learned today with your colleagues, invite them to join our next webinar, and visit cal.org for more resources to help support your multilingual learners. Nick, I don't know if you have any more closing remarks.
No, that's great. So just thank you to everyone for being a part of our webinar today. Thanks so much.